This is part two of Revolution and U.S. intervention in Central America. And at the end of part one, we talked about how the Sandinistas really benefited from the incredible, politically they benefited from the corruption and the ham-handedness of the Somoza government. But the Sandinistas also benefited from a change in U.S. government. Jimmy Carter was elected in 1976 and took office in January of 1977, and he attempted to promote human rights and democracy throughout the hemisphere. Now, moreover, Somoza, who had many allies in the United States, seemed to be losing the war. Between 1977 and 1979, there were three major Sandinista offensives, and they were doing quite well. And as it really looked like the end was near for Somoza, his men did something quite horrific and stupid. And that is, as the war was being covered by the U.S. media, a couple of Somoza's troops stopped some U.S. journalists, and they ended up actually murdering ABC's foreign correspondent Bill Stewart. And this was captured on videotape and shown throughout the world. And next to the web link for this lecture, I'll have a web link of that video if you choose to see it. It's something that, particularly in the late 1970s, we didn't have the internet and that sort of thing, that this was just flashed around the world, the murder of an American journalist. And that, along with all the momentum that the Sandinistas had, led just a few weeks later, essentially a month later, to Somoza leaving the country. Now, he was such a horrible human being that his last order was for his own Air Force to bomb Managua. And of course, the Air Force, to their great credit, refused the order. And on July 19th, 1979, the Sandinistas entered Managua victoriously. More than 100,000 people came out to greet them, and the Carter administration, thinking it was learning the lessons from Cuba, immediately offered tremendous support, financial support, to the Sandinistas. They didn't want to alienate them. And they were just incredibly popular. I mean, here they are entering Managua as conquering heroes. And at first, their program was wildly popular. They extended health care to almost all of the population. Literacy quickly jumped. It was a very illiterate, very poor country. It jumped from 12% to 50%. All this land the Somozistas had taken, the National Guard had taken, was now redistributed in an agrarian reform. And they had very, very good relations with the Catholic Church. There were several priests in the Sandinista Directorate, which is what they called the cabinet. They expanded voting rights, and they sought a democratic framework for their government. Now remember, they came to power in July of 1979. And in November of 1980, Ronald Reagan was elected president. And he was extremely conservative, particularly in foreign relations. And he quickly changed course and saw the Sandinistas as dangerous, Castro-like communists. He said they were Marxist-Leninists. Now, we talked about this term Leninism. Leninism is a one-party state. The Sandinistas had many parties, conservative parties, parties to the left of them. The Communist Party was a different party than the Sandinistas. The Sandinistas were not communists. But Reagan didn't care. He saw them all in this kind of lens of the Cold War as communists, and he created a dissident army known as the Contras, who practiced what's called low-intensity warfare. They placed landmines around schools and health clinics. Nicaragua, during this time, was the world's largest importer of pediatric prosthetics because so many children were injured by the Contras. And the U.S. Army, the U.S. government paid for an army of more than 15,000, even though Congress outlawed it. And this became a big scandal. Ronald Reagan sold weapons to the Iranians and lied about it and used the money that he got from that to secretly fund this war. This is known as the Iran-Contra scandal. Now, in addition to the illegal funding, Reagan worked with the Argentine intelligence services to train the Contras. And these were some of the worst abusers of human rights in the world. Carter had condemned them, and Reagan worked closely with them. And then, when the Argentines invaded Great Britain's Falkland Islands, this became a real crisis for Ronald Reagan because two of his closest allies, Great Britain and Argentina, were involved in this war. So this became a just incredibly complicated situation. The Sandinistas, though, really just were very clear-headed about what had to be done. They snuck an assassination team into Paraguay to kill Somoza. That's his armored Mercedes-Benz, which was destroyed by a rocket-propelled grenade, a Sandinista hit team. And they also said, well, we hate Somoza and we're going to stand up to him. We are small d Democrats. And so they held elections in 1984. Now, the U.S. told its allies to sit out the elections because if they knew the Sandinistas were going to win, and they said, look, if they win in a free and open election, it's hard for us to oppose them. So by having the opposition sit out, the United States could say, oh, see, they're dictators. Well, Daniel Ortega was the most popular man. He did win the election, and in 1985, he held a constitutional assembly to write a new constitution. There he is. I think that cover of Time magazine says it all, the man who makes Reagan see red. The problem was, as well as the Sandinistas were governing Nicaragua, they were fighting a war, essentially, against the most powerful nation in the world. And the Contra War ultimately succeeded, partly because the hardliners among the Sandinistas won the argument. They said, we can't not stand up to these guys. And so there was more and more of a crackdown. Military spending grew tremendously and took money away from social services and this sort of thing. Rights were restricted. There was a state of emergency because it was a war. Many in the middle class left the country, took their money with them. Inflation, when you see a number like 33,000%, that's an estimate, but there was hyperinflation. Now, internationally, this war was condemned. There were cases. The UN voted against it. The International Court of Justice voted against it. The United States violated lots and lots and lots of laws, but it ultimately was successful in that it really kind of ruined the Sandinistas' rule, at least for the time being. But the Sandinistas really were democratic. They were not Marxist-Leninists, and so they held an open election in 1990. They were sure they were going to win, but the Contra War had worn down the nation. And Violeta Chamorro, the widow of Joaquim Chamorro, the La Prensa editor, won. And she kind of instituted a mix of neoliberal economic reforms, which we'll talk about in the next section of the class, but also kept some of the Sandinistas' reforms. And there she is. But the 1990 election showed something really kind of complicated, that the Sandinistas really were like Sandino. Ortega, who had been elected in a free and open election, handed power over to the person who beat him in a free and open election. And that's important to get. Nicaragua is still a democracy. Ortega won the presidency again in 2006 and then again in a second term. And he's not the best president, but he is popular and he is being elected. At the same time all of this was going on, there was a much bloodier civil war that was extremely problematic that was taking place in El Salvador. And this is another example of these kind of these connections, because in the popular mind, and in fact, there were important ties between the Salvadoran and Nicaraguan revolutions. In 1972, a man named Jose Napoleon Duarte from the Christian Democratic Party and Guillermo Ungo won the election. And the military voided the election. These guys were seen as too radical, even though they're very centrist. The Catholic Church actually intervened, and rather than torture them to death, these men were released and sent into exile. Throughout the 1970s, the left organized to oppose this dictatorship. And they took their name from, the old Salvadoran radical leader who had been friends with Sandino, Farabundo Martí. They made the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front. They were like the Sandinistas, but much more left-wing. They were much, much to the left of the Sandinistas. Guillermo Ungo joined them, but Duarte opposed them, right? These old guys from 1972. In fact, Duarte was put in the presidency with the encouragement of the Carter administration, and the Carter administration essentially forced the military dictatorship out, and they were going to try to force through a democracy with Duarte in charge. But the left didn't think that was good enough and didn't like the fact that the United States had put Duarte in, and there was an intense, extremely violent civil war in the late 1970s and throughout the 1980s. This was really a horrific and bloody war. And El Salvador was among the most polarized places in the world. The FMLN was very far left and very violent. And the right employed things called death squads. And they would kill indiscriminately anyone that they thought was a threat to right-wing governance. They murdered many U.S. citizens who were there, including Catholic nuns. And in perhaps one of the most horrific modern examples of uncontrolled violence, a death squad, in the name of conservative rule, murdered the Archbishop, Oscar Romero, while he was saying Mass in 1980. Now, this photo of the assassination wasn't released until 2009 because the government knew that it was so, it would just inflame passion so much, and the government, by 2009, had to admit its culpability in this. Now, the Civil War just grinded on and on throughout the 80s into the 90s. And what's interesting about it, not in the 90s, throughout the 80s, is that the Civil War was not settled with U.S. guns or U.S. aid. The U.S. had been completely discredited in the region at this time. The U.S.'s anti-Nicaragua policies, which were seen as highly illegal by almost everyone in the world, the U.S. funding of this war and the horrific violence it entailed, really discredited the country. And Costa Rica, which was a democracy, still is, its president, a man named Oscar Arias, hosted a regional peace conference. And he was going to settle the issues in El Salvador, and he pointedly told the United States that it couldn't even attend. And after tremendous pressure, he let the United States have diplomats there who could not speak. They could only be observers. And this regional peace conference, organized by the Costa Rican president, set the stage for the first true elections and in the country. There was a truce, and then elections, and then truth commissions to uncover what had happened and who was culpable for what had gone on. So what's interesting about this is a group of Central Americans decided that they had to keep the United States out of the region. And this was something that the world appreciated. Oscar Arias won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1987 for his work in this. And this is a really important moment. And this shows a different side to that Latin American, Central American, Caribbean basin cohesion of shared history, that the Costa Ricans nudge the Americans out and say, we'll fix your mess. And we'll fix our own mess, because a lot of this is made here too. But we don't need you, and we don't need the Cold War mentality. And as you can see, 1987, the Cold War is winding down. So this is a real Latin American moment that fixes something that was so much organized around ideas of communism and anti-communism. And the Latin Americans come up and say, no, it's not. And we have Latin American solutions to these Latin American problems.